Greetings, fellow Miamians, as we gather together to celebrate the bicentennial of Miami University. What a wonderful university we have, and how many events will take place this year in observance of the bicentennial. One of them, the Charter Day Ball, and there will be many others. And we look with pride upon all that's been accomplished over the 200 years that Miami has been chartered and a university. We think back over those 200 years to one of the quotations most frequently used, that from the preeminent poet of the 20th century, Robert Frost, who said Miami had the prettiest campus that ever there was. And indeed, we would agree then, we agree today, and we believe it always will be the prettiest college that ever there was. No accident that such was the case. Our first board of trustees determined that it would be easier for students to learn in an attractive environment than in an unattractive one. And so they said, let's set aside in this virgin wilderness that we're creating a campus from, a part of it on the northern edge to be known as the Botanical Gardens, forerunner of what today we call the Formal Gardens. Our first president, Robert Hamilton Bishop, said that he was determined that it would be a beautiful campus, and he had in mind a model on which he proposed to build this one. He was a graduate of the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. The model he had in mind was Yale in New Haven, Connecticut. He determined that our buildings should be red brick, Georgian colonial, like the Yale buildings of that time. It's no accident that our two oldest buildings on campus today, Eliot and Stoddard, dating from 1828 and 1835, look like Yale's oldest building, Connecticut Hall, dating from 1756. Bishop believed we should be the Yale West, not only in appearance, but also in quality. He determined we should have a curriculum like Yale's. We should have a faculty and student body like Yale's. One of our very first faculty members was John Witherspoon Scott, professor of science. And it was his daughter, Carolyn, born here in Oxford at the corner of Campus and High, who eventually would become engaged to and then marry a young Miami graduate of the class of 1852, Benjamin Harrison, who later would become President of the United States. And Oxford's own Carolyn Scott Harrison would be the First Lady of the land. Another of Miami's early professors, William Holmes McGuffey, living in a little brick home on Spring Street, would become world-renowned for the textbooks he prepared in that little brick house, become known as the McGuffey Readers, the most celebrated textbooks in world history, exceeding 122 million copies in publication and still in print in the year 2009. The McGuffey Readers would make of William Holmes McGuffey the title Schoolmaster to the Nation. In the early 1830s, President Bishop believed we were becoming too large when we had a student body of more than 100. And so he asked that students organize small groups in which every member of the student body would have a chance for membership. First to emerge would be literary societies, the Aradelphian and the Union. The Aradelphians adopted the color red as their color. The Unions adopted the color white. They didn't believe it at the time, but those colors have become the official colors of Miami University, and they are to this day. Remember the 1830s, not only for McGuffey, for the literary societies, but also for the birth of Greek letter fraternities on this campus. Fraternities that over the course of the decades that would follow would establish other chapters across the land, that by the end of the century Miami would be known as the mother of fraternities. And then it was in the late 19th century, specifically the year 1888, that the then president of Miami, Ethelbert W. Warfield, a graduate of Princeton, would bring with him from Princeton a new sport for this area, the sport of football. The first football game played in Ohio at any level, high school, college, professional, would be football played here at Miami. And Warfield, the members of the faculty themselves played in that game. We've had many other distinguished players over the years, most recently Ben Roethlisberger. We all remember from the Super Bowl several Sundays ago, his role in bringing to the Pittsburgh Steelers another Super Bowl crown. We, in the 20th century, would become legendary for the number of great coaches we prepare, and the moniker Cradle of Coaches would become attached to our name. And before that century be out, yet another label would come to us, a public ivy. The University of California would bring out a book late in the 20th century entitled The Public Ivies, listing 8 public universities in the nation who were Ivy League-like in quality, and Miami University was one of the 8. And here we are today, celebrating 200 years of wonderful history of this great university, and we believe the best years are yet to come. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Robert Keller, University Architect and Campus Planner for Miami University. I'd like to share with you some images of the campus that span its history from inception to present day and even beyond as we plan for the future. Some of the images may surprise you and some will be familiar. But regardless, I hope you enjoy this look back at our first 200 years as much as I've enjoyed putting it together.
All Miami alums are familiar with Slant Walk and the gates that mark the northwest entrance to our campus. But this landmark with the Phi Delta Theta gates hasn't always appeared this way. Prior to 1973, there was another gateway that was totally obscured by landscaping when this photo was taken. And here's an earlier image when the walk was a herringbone patterned brick sidewalk with these gates adorning its entrance. These were the Centennial gates, brand new in this 1909 photograph. Yet, prior to that time, there was an earlier, more modest gateway comprised simply of these cast iron posts. And in an earlier time, Slant Walk was neither concrete nor brick, but rather a gravel and dirt path. And in the earliest days of the campus, there was no gate structure at all, simply a path into the campus. This brings us back to the founding of Miami University in 1809, the establishment of the Mile Square to provide for its funding, and the start of classes in 1824 with Robert Bishop as the first president. The first structure was a log schoolhouse built in 1811, followed by Franklin Hall in 1819, to which was added the main structure in 1824 for the opening of classes to an enrollment of 58 young men. Elliott and Stoddard Halls were built in 1828 and 1836 respectively as residence halls for an enrollment that had expanded to a whopping 152. We're all familiar with Stoddard and Elliott because they still exist and are still used as residence halls today. But many other buildings have come and gone over the decades, some almost completely forgotten, such as a small laboratory building known as Old Egypt that existed in the heart of campus for 60 years. And although the majority of the buildings that were built still exist and are still in use today, they've undergone many changes during their lifetime, creating different memories of the campus to different generations of students. This earliest known photograph of the campus was taken in 1858 at a time when it was common to whitewash buildings to preserve the soft clay brick. Hence, our red brick campus wasn't red at all for some of the very early students. This rendering shows the extent of Miami University when it closed in 1873. Miami was actually closed for 12 years, primarily due to the strains caused by the Civil War, but it reopened in 1885 under the leadership of President Robert McFarland. Hence the line in the song of our alma mater, Old Miami, New Miami. In 1892, the enrollment was growing again to the extent that a new science building was needed, so Bryce Hall was constructed at the north end of where King Library stands today. This is one of my favorite photographs of the early campus. That dirt path going from left to right across the lower part of the screen is actually Spring Street. Another striking feature is that there were so few trees on the campus at that time. Of course, the buildings were primarily heated with wood-burning stoves and fireplaces in those days, and it looks to me like the students cut their wood right on campus. Our football team played in the heart of campus in 1891, as you can see in this photo with Stoddard Hall in the background. And if you look really close, you can see a few students with their legs dangling out the third floor windows watching the game. But by 1896, sports were becoming so popular that the Miami Athletic Grounds were constructed on the north side of High Street across from campus at the corner of Patterson and High. That's where Miami Field would later stand for several years. And if we could pass through that doorway of this modest entry, this is what we would see. The turf clearly needed a lot more work, but there were bleachers for the fans, and we can see a running track around the perimeter with some wooden hurdles scattered around. Here's an action shot during a football game on that field. Evidently, they realized by then that it was a good idea to wear a helmet on their head, although there were 2 or 3 holdouts that are still bareheaded. And of course, there was a ball diamond for the national pastime of baseball. The first gymnasium was built in 1897, in part for the physical education of our female students, the first of whom had arrived just a few short years before when Miami became coeducational for the first time. And ladies, I think it goes without saying, you've come a long way since then. At the end of the 19th century, Harrison Hall received its final edition, and it remained that way until it was replaced nearly 60 years later with the Harrison Hall that we know today that's in the same location. The original Harrison Hall served as an academic building, an administrative building, and a gathering place for extracurricular activities of the students. By the turn of the 20th century, as the enrollment was continuing to grow, students began creating formal organizations such as the Bicycle Club, in addition to the less formal student activities like the one in the lower left frame. Throughout the 19th century, the enrollment had fluctuated between 140 to a little over 200 students. But from 1900 to 1915, our student population exploded to nearly 800 students. To meet these growing needs, new buildings were needed. In fact, 9 new buildings were added during that time, and our university began to change from a small cluster of buildings to an organized campus with the creation of our first defined exterior spaces and our first quadrangle. The first of those new buildings was the original Hepburn Hall, the first residence hall for women, ironically named after a president that was opposed to a co-ed university. This is also the first example of a building name moving from one building to another. Today we know Hepburn Hall as the one built in 1964 in the North Quad. And I've since discovered that there have been many name changes and moves over the years. Other significant buildings included what was then known as the Auditorium, then it was Benton Hall, and now it's Hall Auditorium. Alumni Hall, built in 1909, has also had many changes. Of course, 1909 was our centennial year, and those centennial gates seen earlier appeared at that same time. As would be expected, there was a centennial celebration in 1909, and just possibly, it was the beginning of our Parade of Classes tradition that occurs during Alumni Weekend today. To my surprise, I discovered that even 100 years ago, they were dealing with a sense of change on the campus as exemplified in this 1912 Recensio, alluding to the arrival of Bishop Hall. And I love this photo of what I would imagine was the unauthorized Bishop Band. Our first chemistry building was a modest structure on the site of where Krieger Hall stands today. This campus photo, showing Wells Hall in the background, also gives a hint of the impact that the automobile was already starting to have on the campus. I would have never guessed that there was a time when parking was allowed right on the main quad along the south side of Harrison Hall. And I was very surprised to find that not only have we moved the names of buildings around campus, we've actually even moved entire buildings around campus, as shown in this picture of the gymnasium, later known as Heron Hall, and later still known as Van Voorhis Hall, moved from its original location to a new site about 100 yards to the east. Yes, we've moved a gymnasium to make way for the construction of Ogden Hall. Swing Hall was the first major university building built north of High Street. It too had an addition a short time later, that dramatically changed its size. We've had an observatory that was later purchased by an amateur astronomer and moved to northern Ohio. And we've expanded the campus by acquisition of existing properties many times over the years, some being sizable purchases of significant buildings. This 1930s campus map and photos show the extent of Miami's change in the early 20th century. A building that saw much excitement during its time as the home of our basketball team was Withrow Court. This building spawned many outstanding athletes that went on to have a very successful career. In 1939, Sims Hall was constructed, and is significant because it was the first building commissioned to Charles Solarius, a Cincinnati architect that over the course of the next 3 decades would design more than 30 structures in Miami, including the Beta Bells, and would change the campus more significantly than any other single architect in our history. It was he who brought the Georgian architectural style here and laid out the large residential quadrangles. Although he didn't have anything to do with Tuffy's, which became a mainstay of our student social life around that same time frame. World War II brought much change to the university, just as it did to the entire world. Many new programs were added to support the war. The influx of students made possible by the GI Bill created the need for more space very quickly. Military buildings that were no longer needed at the military bases were brought to campus, and the lodges and the Veterans Village were born. It's almost impossible to imagine today, but by necessity, this was part of our campus for several years after the war. By 1946, the enrollment had mushroomed to over 5,000 students that needed a place to gather. So our first actual student center building was built just east of where Rowdebush Hall stands today. Upham Hall, one of the primary icons of the campus, followed shortly thereafter. This was another of the many Charles Solarius buildings. By the midpoint of this century, the campus had expanded significantly since that first growth spurt from 1905 to 1915, but that was nothing compared to what was to occur over the next 20 years. From approximately 1952 to 1970, an amazing 62 new structures would be added to the campus, increasing its size from approximately 2 million square feet to nearly 6 million square feet in just 20 years. These included the University Center in 1957, now known as the Shriver Center, expansion in the south and east quads with new residence halls and new dining halls, and the north quad in the late 1950s and 60s. And yet, more residence and dining halls were added for an enrollment that exceeded 8,000 students by 1961. New traditions were created during these booming years, and old traditions were solidified. Move-in day became more challenging, Greek life flourished, and the modern era was upon us. In the 1960s, the enrollment reached almost 12,000 students, and the buildings began to get bigger. A good example being Millett Hall and this great ceremonial groundbreaking photograph. The 60s were a time of change and excitement, a changing culture, new music, new dances, and there never seemed to be a dull moment. So much so that sometimes it was hard to keep up, and you had to catch a nap wherever you could, or simply crash at the end of a long day. Although a new development slowed dramatically in the 1970s and 80s, the Western College for Women became a part of Miami in 1974, and some prominent buildings were built during that time. And student life continued to change. The 1990s brought more attention to health and well-being, and we saw the construction of the Recreational Sports Center and a new Health Services Center, both offering new programs to students. Even more recently, we've seen improvements in our athletic facilities that would have been unimaginable to those that constructed that first Miami athletic grounds back in 1896. We now have student apartment-style housing right on campus with the construction of Heritage Commons in 2005. In the last 2 years, we've added new academic buildings for the School of Engineering and Applied Science and the Psychology Department, creating a new academic quadrangle adjacent to where Miami Field once stood. Several updates and improvements have been made to King Library in recent years. And this summer, we'll complete the construction of the new Farmer School of Business building, which will once again bring the entire school under one roof and add a much-needed auditorium to the university. And the planning continues, both short-term and long-range. We continue to plan because students continue to change, and their academic needs will continue to change. In the laboratory, or in the classroom, from tablet-arm chairs and a podium to a highly flexible and interactive classroom for today's new technology. And we have a much better appreciation for the importance of the students' time outside of the classroom. Currently, we're planning for tomorrow's students' needs. As we've seen, our Miami has continually changed from its earliest years to the present. We now have a Miami Metro bus system and art programs. Uptown Oxford has changed too, but much remains the same. And things that have changed maybe haven't changed as much as we think. But regardless of which period of Miami's glorious 200 years of history we each hold near and dear to our hearts, and regardless of how brief our years here at Miami may now seem, the strong and enduring bonds that were forged in that time last a lifetime. Weave the story of thy glory. Thank you, Miami University, and happy anniversary.
Greetings. I hope that you have enjoyed this retrospective of Miami as much as I have, starting with Dr. Shriver and through Bob Keller's amazing reconstruction of the history of Miami buildings, the campus, right up to the modern day. I also hope that you've enjoyed your time together during the bicentennial Charter Day Ball, that you had an opportunity to reconnect with friends, with old classmates, and maybe with a few new folks that represent different generations of Miamians. And that's one of the great things about being at Miami. The way we relate to each other, make old friends or renew old friendships and make new friends. Always part, though, of this very, very special place, this very special community of people that we call Miami. So here we are, 200 years old, having just celebrated our bicentennial. It is a moment of great joy for all of us to think about what those who have come before us have done to make this day possible. And we're very proud of who we are today. But at this moment, it is now time to turn and look to the future. As John Millett said at the time of our sesquicentennial, the best way to honor the past is to build the future. So here we stand at our 200th anniversary, looking backwards with great joy over what we have accomplished, and great joy today at what we are. But the most exciting part of all is to look forward and to imagine how we here today will make Miami better for the future. How we will connect to new generations of students, giving them the same opportunities that we had to go to one of the finest universities in the country, to excel beyond our wildest imaginations. So it is our time to look to the future and to do as John Millett said, to honor the past by building the future. So I hope that you will join with me, with all of the students and faculty and staff who are Miami today, and with all of your alumni, friends, and colleagues from all the generations that you know, that we join together to do as our alumni did at the time of our centennial, to provide a legacy for the future of Miami, so that when the next video is constructed, our legacy, the Bicentennial Student Center, will be the jewel in that crown. So thank you all for being such an important part of the bicentennial celebration. And let's do as John Millett called for. Let's honor that past, that incredible, wonderful, wonderful past, by building an even more extraordinary future. Thank you.